Last time we talked about unemployment as a rate and the trend over time of unemployment changing, and we also mentioned a little bit about the natural unemployment rate, that people naturally will switch jobs, and that for a period of time between jobs they will naturally be unemployed. And so there are actually changes over time between the natural unemployment rate. So for example, young people tend to switch jobs more than people in their middle age. So if you think about the baby boomers coming through, they were young during a period of time that meant, a large proportion of the workforce was young and switching jobs frequently, and so the natural rate of unemployment was higher. And then as time went on, they became a bigger part of the middle-aged workforce and switched less often. And so there's actually the amount of unemployment we'd expect to see, all else equal, even if our economy is behaving similar to other times, might change depending on the demographics of the workforce. So part of a discussion of unemployment has to include what companies and businesses are actually buying when they hire workers, and that's in general some kind of output productivity. Right? If I'm a coffee shop and I hire a barista, I'm hoping they do a good job, making the coffee and being pleasant to the customers, and that there's some kind of output from their labor inside the business. And so and different and workers, right? Workers have their own skills they bring to the table, right, that affect their employability. But there are more factors than just the individuals that come to bear when thinking about the productivity of a person. So in particular, for example, if we have governmental institutions that are not supportive or efficient, then it can be, even though a person may be morally responsible and educated, they may not be able to work to their full potential because of obstacles that are in their way, because of infrastructure concerns, or so for example, I can be a very talented day trader of stock, but if the power keeps going out and I can't get access to the internet, it's going to be harder for me to be an effective participant in the global markets compared to the exact same person being in New York City, even if all the governmental stuff is the same. Right? So there are lots of other things sort of going on that make people more or less productive at what they're trying to do, and that's going to affect employability. So here, this is just to show how times have changed. So if we go back to 1960, you can see, the majority of workers, right? We're up to, it's like over 50% of workers were living on less than $3 a day, right? There's a huge spike at $2.40, $2.50, which is basically China and India being in the exact same place. So China and India, their population on average, were living for under $3 a day, and then the rest of the world was either below that, but in small population numbers, or above that, sort of increasing until you get up to the Western democracies, where we're at 35 or so, or I guess maxing out at wherever the U.S. is at, like something like 64, I think. So in 1960. So if we compare that to where things are lately, you can see, right, so a shift to the right is a shift to more money per day. And this is on a log scale, so every tick mark is a doubling of daily income. And you can see, right, India doubling their daily income of their people twice over, and China 3 times over. Right, so those spikes now exist much further to the right. And that, then there's a bunch of population now below India and China in their, down at the 248 range, right? So that the large populations in China and India over the course of 1960 to 2011 passed up a lot of other countries in daily wages, and in China making a huge shift. So if you think about that in terms of welfare, that's a huge change, right? If you think about if your daily income could not so double 3 times over, right? So that's multiply by a factor of 8, right? So if you so a person making $10,000 in 1960 would make $80,000 again on an inflation adjusted basis, right? So that's a huge swing in income in those countries, and we see gains too in in other places, right? But for that top of that graph there, it's just a shift of maybe one doubling or so, or maybe 1.5, right? So, but we do still see, right, for the whole chart, we see a lot of major shifts in welfare, and this story gets repeated over and over again, that the planet now compared to 1960 is much wealthier as a whole than it was, and a lot of those gains were to people in extreme poverty. So we talked before in our other chapter when we were discussing GDP, we sort of had a discussion about that GDP doesn't necessarily represent everything, that there might be other non-productivity measures of well-being, right? So you can think about how unemployment would tie into this. If one is unemployed, or if unemployment is common, there might be a negative, right? You might feel less secure in your work. You might feel bad for your friends that are struggling. You're actually more likely to experience crime. And so unemployment feeds into this, but there's a lot of ways we can think about non-productivity measures factoring into to overall well-being. This in this table, this is an example of how we might think about that just a little bit. And so there's a couple different ways. So there's over here in the decomposition, they have the 4 different maybe like non-productivity measures. So on the left we have consumption, so that's sort of like productivity, although it's consumption as a share of the output, right? So how much do you actually get to use? And that can be nice, right? I mean, to actually get to use it and not to be continually reinvesting, at least in the short term. That means that you get to benefit from the economic productivity and not, the future generations. So especially, you can imagine if consumption isn't happening, or you're not getting luxuries or delicious food or homes with enough space or whatever in exchange for investment in things that don't make sense to invest in, then this is going to negatively affect your overall welfare. And so, and we can see these are a whole bunch of country-based differences for these 4 dimensions. So we have consumption and leisure, and consumption inequality and leisure inequality. So the notion here is that if everybody around me is having beluga caviar and I'm not, that's so not only am I not having beluga caviar, I'm seeing my neighbors eat it. So that this is like extra distressing or something. So again, that's a sort of a human psychology component, but that does seem to be true, right? That more egalitarian societies tend to have they tend to have an overall better sense of well-being than societies with big inequalities. So if we look at that decomposition, you can kind of see actually that even though, so the United States still actually has the biggest consumption equivalent welfare in the sample that we're looking at. But if you remember from output, the U.S.'s output per person is quite a bit higher than almost the rest of the planet. I mean, I think Singapore might be an exception. And then some of the states, like the Arab states. But once you do welfare adjustments, it's not quite as clear. So, for example, in the UK, the UK is the second richest country in the sample by income, but they have a better life expectancy. than we do. They have lower consumption inequality and leisure inequality, more leisure than we do, right? So even though, right, so the only way the U.S. actually comes out ahead is that we just consume a lot, right? So in the U.S. we get to consume a ton of stuff, and that makes up for our lack of leisure and the fact that, the wealth classes have significantly more consumption and leisure compared to the upper middle class in the United States, right? And this story repeats for a lot of Western Europe, right? So France was famous for their 35-hour work weeks, and so that does show up in income, right? So the French have a much lower income compared to the United States, but then benefit from better leisure, and and other factors lead to lower inequality. So, and then, right, we can look at kind of an opposite situation where, so for example, in Russia, income is better than it is in Mexico, but is really severely hampered by a lack of consumption, right? That the Russian people themselves don't get to benefit from the wealth their country creates relative to the United States. And so if you think about that in terms of unemployment rate, employment income is how most of us participate in the economic, right? How most of us accrue benefits from our economy, right? If you think about the U.S. as a big entity that produces a bunch of output that is then consumed, right? Our participation in that process is generally as laborers of some kind, right? That we sell our labor for money and then purchase some of the output. So that all feeds into this, right? So there are differences across countries in how much income is received and also these non-income benefits. It's also true, right? If we want to understand unemployment, it helps to think about productivity and what the drivers of productivity are. So if in the Handbook of Macroeconomics, they talk at length about this. The basic idea, usually when we're doing, it's called, this is development accounting, right? We're thinking about, all right, so we have some kind of output per worker, right? And some countries have more output per worker than others. And if we're just to sit back and think about, all right, well, what would cause that, right? Well, a country might have a lot of economic output per worker. If, for example, it had, what if they had a whole bunch of factories full of robots? Well, that would be really handy, right? So if you have a whole bunch of factories full of robots that are making things, then that would be really useful for having a lot of output per worker. Another thing we can suspect, right, is that if we have a really educated populace, that would do something. We could also maybe think, well, shoot, are we? But if obviously we're educating people that then turn around and are not used for anything, then that would be, even though we'd have a bunch of education, it wouldn't necessarily show up in output well. Also, if we think heavily about, well, what if I'm buying a bunch of capital but not really using it efficiently? That might show up as well, right? So but in general, if education is being effectively used and the capital is being effectively used, more capital and more education should lead to more output. And right, so that's sort of how this model works. But what's happened here is we've renormalized, right, based on the capital and human capital of the United States, right? So if we think about for example, Hong Kong has only 85% of the output per worker of the United States, right? So Hong Kong produces a little bit less than the United States does. But if we think about their capital share relative to output, so if they are producing 85% less than we are, then you would expect that maybe they have 85% less capital. And it looks like that's not quite true. It might be actually a little more than 85%. And so in Hong Kong, they actually have slightly more capital than you would expect given the output difference. So that's kind of how that normalization works, right? Is that obviously if you have very little output, you would expect to see very little capital, all else equal, and but if you end up seeing more, that would mean more capital intensity, right? So so you can go through the countries and see, some are higher and some are lower, and you have the same thing with education, right? So if you were going to sit around and think about, well, shoot, what kind of country would have really high capital but not a lot of output, right? So I've got a bunch of capital, but I'm not necessarily using it to the greatest. And if I'm just thinking off the top of my head, I would think that maybe Japan might be a candidate for that, only because they have a ton of government expenditure on infrastructure, right? So they spend a ton of money on infrastructure, and that's great and benefits them, but it seems definitely at least possible that that because so much is spent on infrastructure, that the infrastructure projects that are undertaken aren't, right? So they'll do the really critical ones and then also even more, right? And so the ones that are even more aren't going to be as valuable as the ones that really needed to be done. And that's actually what we see, right? If you look in this chart, in Japan has the highest capital to output ratio of any country in the list. But it's also true, and they comment on this in the paper, right, that this is basically pretty stable. So if you think about how much, right, the output from the capital you get is about what you'd expect kind of all over. But that there's not huge differences in the capital itself, right? This is not true for human capital. So you can see the really successful GDP countries are really good at using human capital, right? The United States is top, Hong Kong does really well, and that as we travel down the list, we're not so good at using human capital. So we have less and less human capital. But okay, so sorry. So if we get to the whole model, right? So the original idea was that we have total factor productivity. It's called. It's kind of like a mystery multiplier, right? So you take human effort and you take capital and you work really hard and you get some output, but it's not what you expected probably. So sometimes it's high and sometimes it's low compared to what you predict from the capital and labor that were used. And so if you have a country where this is consistently really low, right? You look at the capital and you look at the education, and output should be way up here and it's actually way down here, right? That is indicative of low, right? That's kind of like a mystery factor. It's like, well, for some reason, output is really bad. And in other countries, for some reason, output is good. So if we normalize to 1, right? So if the United States is 1, we'd see that, for example, Singapore is basically exactly the same as the United States in this mystery factor, right? So Singapore has less output, but that's to a great degree because they have a less educated workforce, right? So they have more capital, less educated workforce, but there's no mystery reduction, right? You take those two factors and you get about what you'd expect, right? What if we go down to Malawi, right? You can take capital and you have the right amount of capital that you'd expect, and you take education, which is less than you'd expect, at least compared to the United States, but then there's this enormous shift, right? So 94% of the GDP effect, right? So 94% of what we're not seeing is caused by this mystery factor, by total factor productivity. So you can kind of imagine there's no unified theory for what goes in here, but you can imagine some things that would matter a lot. If you have an unstable government, then it's really hard to, right? So you might have capital, but everybody's hiding because they don't want to get chased down by a band of rebels, or you might have education, but you're not working in a job that uses your education because you're not working at all because there are no jobs, because the firms have all been dismantled by chaos or corruption or something, right? So you can think, okay, these economies might have the capital and the human capital they need to at least produce a little bit, but that there are other factors that reduce it by a lot relative to the United States. So another way to think about it is in the U.S., we can take capital and human capital, right, education and assets, and turn them into a lot of output. In Singapore, we can do the same. In Hong Kong, the same. Right? In the UK, the same. France, Germany, Japan, not so much. South Korea, less. And down it goes, right? So, and so you can, I mean, as we look at these countries, you can sort of kind of imagine some rough patterns, but in what you see for which countries have low total factor productivity and which countries have high, but there's no real obvious explanation that ties everything up. Although you can get part of the way with some things. Right, so one structural cause of unemployment can be, right, if you have really, really, really low total factor productivity, then you can have, right, if I hire a worker and I give them the capital they need, but nothing comes out of it anyway, why would I hire the worker in the first place, right? So you can imagine that unemployment is probably pretty high in countries that have really low total factor productivity, at least sometimes. So this is, right, so we can see what we're connecting here, right? So we have total factor productivity, again, normalized to 1 in the United States, right? So if we are high up in this list, we are, right, the mystery production amount is close to the United States or higher, right? And if you're down on the bottom, right, if your y-axis value is close to 0, you're mysteriously really bad at producing things, given the capital and labor input. And on the XY, we have the actual GDP per worker. So what this shows, and this is obviously, right, there's a very strong connection, right? These points, again, could be a circle, but it's this big oblong blob. We have like a positive connection here, and that is that the greater the output, right, the greater the output per worker, right, the greater the total factor productivity, and which, right, so that would be true naturally, but also you can imagine, well, what if I'm a country that has a very educated populace and a ton of capital, and I just use it poorly? I could still have a lot of output compared to a country that has very little education and very little capital, but uses what little capital and education they have well, right? And you can see that this is not usually the case, right? Not only do a lot of these countries down, right, so a lot of the lower left-hand corner have very little capital and very little education. What they do have is not used well, right? And that's the connection, right? So, and you can see there's some notable exceptions, right? So Zimbabwe sticks out a lot there, right? And actually, if you look way up to the right, we have, so like Trinidad and Tobago is not maybe, or Barbados, right? These aren't necessarily places you'd expect to see way up in the upper echelons, but right, for whatever reason, now measuring, especially for the poorer countries, measuring is really hard, but you can see that there's a very clear pattern here between output and total factor productivity. So if we, right, so now we have the, right, so so now we're normalizing to 1 for GDP in the United States, and here on the y-axis we have the share of total factor productivity in development, right? So what percent is total factor productivity affecting my output, right? So the mystery, right? The mystery factor is a bigger deal, right? So you can see for developed economies, right? So if I'm way out in, Kuwait, Qatar, Norway, Ireland, the United States, the mystery factor is low, right? It's still I guess 50% or 45%, but the unexplained output variation is small. So if I'm in Ireland or the United States, if I educate my workers, I get more output. If I produce more, I get more output. if I have more capital, I get more output, and it's not a perfect connection, but it works better, as you can see it. But as we move towards lower production, more and more of the productivity is caused by this total factor productivity, by this unknown stuff, right? So, right. So it's almost like it can only hurt you, right? That the non-capital, non-labor stuff is only bad, and it really drags down a lot of countries, right? Some more than others, right? But you can see that, for example, right? So we have like India there has a high total factor productivity share, whereas Belize has less, right? So Belize has the same proportion as about the United States, whereas India has quite a bit more. And so another way to then think about it is that maybe the percent of total factor productivity that affects output is kind of a measure of how efficiently a country's the other things. So again, we don't exactly totally know what this all is, but there's some factors that could be relevant, like the quality institutions, for example. So if you have good governmental institutions that follow the rule of law, that tends to make your capital and labor be used at an efficiency level closer to like the United States or Ireland. But there are other things that go into there too. So this is okay, and again, right, so you can see this is negative, right? So we're sloping down instead of up, right? So the poorer we are, the more likely to be poor because of unknown factors, not because of a lack of investment in people or capital. This is also, right, a negative connection, but this one is, really interesting how this works. So if you'll notice down on this x-axis here, this is population density in 1500. Right, so and population density really is sort of a stand-in for economic development, right? If you have big cities with lots of populace, that's that's where you're imagining, okay, I've got these big metropolises that are doing a bunch of stuff, and then if I have really low population density, it's in 1500 it's open land, right? Hunter gatherers, right? Not much going on. Okay. So you'll see, right, so as we go to the right, we are more and more dense, right, that there's more and more economic development going on in the year 1500. And, all right, so what does it mean? So it means the more developed countries were around 1500, the less their GDP is now, right? That in the year 1500, the United States had a tiny population density, right, that there were very few people living in the continental United States in the year 1500. Right, Australia even less, Canada even less than that. Right, that these countries had very, very few people living in them, and this can, to some degree, explain how this happened in the first place. So if we go to this time period, right around 1500, Latin America, like Central and South America, were actually the really valuable locations to be in, right? That they had a bunch of established, right, there were big empires that had a lot of wealth, and so the Europeans that came to those places set up institutions that, right, in the text it says that basically they set up extractive institutions, right, that we're going to take whatever economy you've got going right now and we're going to siphon off some of it and send it to Europe, right? So you're already in place and we can just pull wealth out and take it home. Whereas in the U.S., there were some furs, right? So there was fur trade, and that's kind of it, right? You had beaver pelts and not much else. And so if anything was going to happen in the United States, it had to be European, right? So European settlers, or at least European institutions that made wealth, sort of naturally grows, right? So in 1500. The U.S. is sort of a wasteland that the only people who want to come to are religious refugees, and then over time, the economic development of the United States grows and grows and grows until it's the crown jewel of all the colonies and breaks free and becomes its own independent nation, right? So, so the more, it's almost like a curse, right? The more valuable you were to your colonizers in 1500, the more they just extracted wealth from your nation, and the less they bothered to develop your local institutions. And you can see this in Argentina. Argentina was actually, right, so very not dense, but was ultimately very very wealthy going into World War I time. So we don't think of Argentina as a very successful country, but 100 years ago it rivaled a lot of the Western democracies in terms of economic influence. And so this held true even, right? So I mean, the Argentina would be more north if their trajectory had kept going. Again, this is kind of the title of this is Reversal of Fortune, but it just goes to show that it's the idea is to talk a little bit about how this productivity can be influenced by other things, by malleable things, right? That basically the policies of incoming European colonizers had a huge effect on the long-term economic output of these countries. And actually, it mentioned in the text there's a small segment of Peru that was under a levy to yield 1 in 7 adult men to work in the mines, and this was true for, it was like, I think, over 200 years. But then it ended in the early 1800s, but 200 years later, there's still a significant difference between the economic development of the region not in that little area and the region in the development in that area, that there are fewer roads and lower educational attainment, and I think 25% less consumption, right? That it's just an economically depressed area relative to its neighbors, and that's leftovers from the way it was treated 200 years ago. One possible explanation for differences in total factor productivity is institutions countries were endowed with during the colonial era, right? So that's one possibility. Another one is government expenditures, right? So you could imagine, well, if I get taxed a ton, maybe that might lead to lower economic growth, and so here this just shows the taxes in the U.S. as a share of GDP. You can see taxes as a percentage of GDP have just skyrocketed from the late 20s, right, from 5 all the way up to 30% at one point as a percentage of GDP. But that this has had very little, if any, effect on growth, right? So again, back to that, it's always 2% no matter what. That seems to be true regardless of government expenditure. Well, and this, so the argument for why this might be is, so these taxes get taxed, but the money also gets spent, and it's not spent on totally useless things, and it's not spent on brilliant things either. It's just probably spent it's spent on normal stuff. At least that's the theory, right? That taxing it and spending it doesn't really seem to have much an effect either way for economic output or growth. Which is maybe surprising. People might have opinions one way or another about whether that government spending is wiser or sillier than the market would naturally gravitate towards on its own without government intervention. So this is tax revenue as a share of GDP, right? So and this is actually right. So if I was to draw the blob, right, it's not a circle, right? This is a blob. It kind of trends up, sort of like a curve. And right, what this is showing is that the more taxes, right, the more tax revenue, the more percent of GDP is in tax revenue, the greater output is, right? So this is maybe contrary to what you may expect. And there's some question about causality, right? So it could be that only rich countries can afford to have an expensive government, but it could also be that expensive governments provide infrastructure that makes economic success possible. so that's another possible explanation is that government expenditures lead to good good structure to grow on. This is another interesting feature. So this graph is going to take a bit to explain, but what we have here is this is the factor productivity of individual industries, right? So you can imagine all the hundreds of different things that an economy does, and some of them are going to be really productive, and some of them will be like really sort of unproductive. And that's because of changing economic conditions, right? So if I have a bunch of money invested in steel, and ultimately the U.S. doesn't need as much steel anymore, and environmental protections from steel emissions make us have a strong preference to import the steel instead of producing it domestically, right? That the steel industry itself could end up low on total factor productivity, whereas meanwhile, investments in like servers for web startups are very, very productive. And right, you don't know which is going to be what when, but there's going to be a spectrum, right? So what's interesting here is you look, so the averages don't mean anything, right? So we can't really compare averages. So it's not like India has shifted left relative to the U.S. or anything, because that doesn't make sense. But what you can see, right, is that India, and to a smaller degree China, have a much more spread out total factor productivity, right? So the mystery productivity parameter in Indian industries are wildly different by industry, and in the United States not as much. I mean, there's still a huge shift, but it's a factor of 16 instead of a factor 4, right, in India. So, right, so if Indian industries are wildly different in their productivity, it's not particularly likely, right, that there are some that industries in India are just hugely more productive than industries in the United States, and also simultaneously industries are hugely less productive. Really what's going on is there are some that are humming along and doing about as well as their Western counterparts, and some that are just terrible, right? And so if you do some adjustments to switch from total factor productivity to revenue, so average difference of the total factor productivity revenue with unfortunate industries, you get the same picture, right? That it's just more spread out in India and China. So why, right? So why would we see these big dispersion in industrial output between these like new on the scene but developing nations and the United States? So this is one possible explanation. So this is the size of a plant over time, right? So you can see in the U.S., if I am an old plant, right? So think about this, right? If I'm alive a long time, I'm a success, right? If I'm a bad plant, right? If this was not a good idea, I'm gonna die out in the United States, right? I will just die. And if it's going well, we'll see an increase in capacity. So I don't know if you noticed, but for example, Chart Industries in La Crosse are located right next to train plant. I think that's 7. But they have been around a while, but they just recently added a whole bunch of productive capacity in their La Crosse location. I think it was, and if I remember right, there was some bigger kilns to produce some bigger heat exchangers, right? But this is a story. This is a consistent story in manufacturing in the United States, right? If you are a manufacturer that's succeeding, you are adding capacity, receiving investment, doing more of what you've already done, successful. And so this is not true, really, in Mexico and India. So you can see after 35 years, plants on average have increased their capacity by a factor of 10 in the United States, right? And that's all plants. So successful ones must be even more, right? So there's some that are good enough to still be around, and some that have grown a ton, and on average we're at 10. Whereas, right, in India, plants after 35 years are maybe 50% bigger, right? So if I'm a really good, successful, well-run operation in India, I will continue to be well-run and successful, but I won't be expanding, right? I won't, compared to the United States, I won't grow as quickly. I won't, right? Because where this would be really efficient, right, is if I can take that really effective plant with effective management or whatever, effective technology, whatever it is, and increase capacity, hire more people, have more production, and right now output is increasing, right? Because I'm allocating resources to my units that are most productive, right? So that happens in the United States, not as much in India, and more so in Mexico, but still significantly behind the United States. So, and then you can get into, well, why, what is it about Mexico and India that prevent capital from flowing into units that have high total factor productivity? And they discuss that in the paper. So that can be an explanation. Partly is that in the United States, we move capital to where it is efficiently applied and pull it out of places where it's inefficient. So I'm a finance guy, not necessarily a management academic. So it's fun to see a role for financing and capital flows showing up in the productivity of everyday stuff. So this is another sort of comment on how total factor productivity can change things. So, or if I look at the time lag between invention and adoption, right? So we have the year of invention and when it was really adopted, right? So in 1825, we have the railway being invented, but we don't really see massive railway adoption until like the 1860s, 1870s, right? So even though the technology existed, it took a long time for the technology to be part of everyday life, right? Even more so for steam and motor ships. And then if you go right to MRI units, right, the invention happens, and very quickly we have MRI units in place being used in medicine. Actually, and you can see the internet is not quite as quick as MRIs, and I can actually speak to that. So a little bit, I know, prior to the loosening up of the restriction on, so in the original incarnation of the internet, right, it was really intended for use by universities and the military. Right? It was restricted. The commercial applications weren't really permitted on the internet. So you had to be a student and you get a login. So when I was in high school, I had a friend that was a web, sort of an administrator for a computer lab on campus, and could have access to the internet, but it was only for students, right? And there were BBS systems you could call in by phone, but really it was kind of just like a communications channel for researchers in the military, and that technology existed for a while. So before the change. So it's actually interesting, right? So this ties in if you were around at this time for the discussion about Al Gore inventing the internet. So he was actually one of the champions of the legislation that permitted commercial activity to happen on the internet. Right, it was opened up to commercial activity, and very quickly the World Wide Web exploded with commercial applications, and now and very quickly you have the internet we have today. So actually you get kind of this interesting historical anecdote. He got criticized for saying he invented the internet, but really the internet was around for a long time, doing researchy stuff, and allowing college students to play like role-playing games with each other, and then that changed very drastically once the sort of the training wheels were taken off and it was allowed to just expand everywhere. But that can also feed into total factor productivity, right? So if as a nation you have for whatever reason structural barriers to adopting new technology, that this can cause relative to your neighbors, right? You to use your human capital and your capital less efficiently. And also over time, the pace of adoption of new technologies has increased, right? That we are more rapidly incorporating new technologies into our everyday life. There we go. So that's the end of the discussion about total factor of productivity as it connects up to unemployment.